Again, it's great to see you all this morning. And this morning, I want us to think about a passage from the second letter of Paul to the church at Corinth, 2 Corinthians, the first part of the 12th chapter. Remember that Paul is writing to a church, pastoring that church, if you will, at a distance. He's answering questions. He's trying to deal with theological issues, with arguments within the congregation about this or that, particularly about one's own spiritual experiences. And you can read between the lines of what Paul deals with in his letters to the Corinthian church, and you can see that there were people who had certain kinds of spiritual experiences, and they believed those were better than other people's spiritual experiences. I mean, it's an old phenomenon. The idea that my experience is more valid than your experience, and the way God has spoken to me is the only way that God speaks. And those sorts of conversations were going on in the Corinthian church. And so Paul is trying to deal with that. And you can see in our passage for today that Paul has had some amazing spiritual experiences, and Paul wants to boast about those, but he doesn't want to boast about those. But if he did boast, he would say this, but I really shouldn't boast. Did you hear that in our text for today? Paul's trying to figure out, he's trying to dance around this issue of boasting. And finally he says, but as amazing as my experiences have been, to keep me from being too elated by those, a thorn was given me in the flesh, and he calls it a messenger of Satan. Satan is a Hebrew word, and it means adversary. This thorn in the flesh was an adversary in Paul's life. It stood in the way of Paul, what Paul wanted to do, and who Paul wanted to fully be. It was a messenger of Satan, an adversary for Paul in his life, this thorn in the flesh. And whenever we read that text, the first thing most of us think about is, I wonder what that thorn in the flesh was. Especially when we know that the word that's translated thorn really could be translated sharp stick or stake. This is more than a little irritant. This is an adversary in his life. This is something that's difficult and painful for Paul. So what is it? Every commentary that you read speculates about this. Down through the ages, people have wondered, what was the thorn in Paul's flesh? Was it headaches? Recurring fever? A kind of recurring malarial sort of fever? Maybe that was it. Was it epilepsy? Epileptic seizures, perhaps? That's what Paul experienced. Richard Rohr suggested that perhaps, back to the boasting issue, it was a big ego that Paul called a thorn in the flesh. I'll tell you what I think it is. If you really want to know what I think that it's something to do with Paul's eyesight. It's an eye problem that Paul has, perhaps. After all, Paul says in the Galatian letter to the Galatians, as he talks to these dear friends of his who have turned away from his teaching, a church that welcomed him with open arms, and that, in fact, he said it was because of his infirmity that he preached to them in the first place, and they didn't hold that against him, he says. In fact, he says, if it were possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. That's an odd expression if Paul's infirmity had nothing to do with his eyes. So perhaps that was it, an eye problem. In fact, at the end of the Galatian letter, Paul takes the quill himself, because normally he dictated all of his letters to a scribe or a secretary. He takes the quill in hand and he writes, "See with what large letters I write when writing in my own hand." So he had to write big because he had an eye problem. Maybe that's it. We don't know. But you can tell just from this sermon, as much time as I've spent on it, that we're captivated by that question. What was the thorn? And I think our paying too much attention to thorns and being captivated by thorns is something that is commonplace in our lives in general, don't you? Think about the headlines that we read in the news. Aren't they almost always thorns? Aren't they thorny issues, thorny problems, thorny tragedies, difficulties? A stake driven in the flesh? An adversarial message that stands in the way of one thing or another that's good? Thorns. I just looked at the last week or two headlines and jotted some down. Listen, gunman kills 1, wounds 8 at Empire State Building. 13 shot in 30 minutes in rising Chicago violence. Teen held captive in deplorable home. Drought disrupts everyday tasks in rural Midwest. Refugee numbers swell as fighting in Syria intensifies. Signs suggest Iran is speeding up work on nuclear program. China, more advanced missiles are said to be on the horizon. Big income losses for those near retirement. Fort Worth dad accused of beating toddler son to death. 218 human cases of West Nile virus in Tarrant County. You know what the headlines have been. And every one of them is a thorn. It's a stake driven in the flesh. It's difficult. And it's those things that seem to really capture our attention, don't they? Yesterday we had a wonderful experience in my hometown of Carthage, Texas. We went there for my mother's 90th birthday celebration. And it was great. We started off the day with a family reunion from 9:30 until 2, and then from 2 to 4, friends joined the party and in celebration of my mother's birthday. It was a wonderful experience. But of course I had this sermon and this text on my mind yesterday, and I thought about the bouquet that we put together as a centerpiece that my brother and I and my sister and stepsisters pitched in. And a beautiful, huge bouquet of roses. And I thought about that bouquet as a kind of symbol for the experience we had because it was so beautiful. I mean, strikingly beautiful. Just like the day was. But as the day progressed, I noticed what we talked about among family and then friends as they arrived. We talked about great memories and all of that, but we also talked about chronic illnesses that people had and how they were managing with that, and the recovery from surgery or the upcoming procedure. We had in the midst of the roses thorns. In the reunion part, we had pictures of some people who'd gone before us, family members. And my brother's picture was there. He died this past spring, as most of you know. His picture was there, and next to it was the flag that was presented at the graveside in honor of his military service. That's a thorn. It's a thorn. When we took family pictures, there was an empty space. When the siblings took our picture with my mother, it's a thorn. In the middle of the beauty of that experience, the thorns were there and they stood out and they were obvious in the midst of the beauty. That's the way it is with thorns. Somehow they capture our attention. But Paul would say, stop focusing on the thorn. Never mind what my thorn was. You have thorns too, but I want to point to something else going on here. I want to point to something else in my life. Paul, who had been beaten many times, beaten with rods, suffered a stoning, shipwrecks, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness. Paul describes all this himself. Exposure to cold, hunger, thirst. Paul had a thorny life, persecuted at times for his faith, imprisoned, Thorns. But Paul would say, no, don't look at the thorns. I want you to focus on something else here. It's something that you've seen too. Even as obvious as the thorns are, I know you have. And experienced it in your own life, most likely. I've seen it in the most unlikely places, in hospital rooms, funeral homes, at the deathbed, the sick room. I mean, I can think about some of the thorny situations in my ministry with families who were a part of the churches I have served. Standing by the graveside of a 16-year-old with her mother. Thorny. 4 days after that, I remember going to the hospital to see friends of ours, a young couple. They were friends before I was one of their pastors. And standing in that hospital room, there before the lifeless body of their 4-year-old son, it was the most thorny kind of situation I could imagine. And I confess to you that though I brought into that situation in the best way that I could, a word of grace, of hope, of peace, a prayer, a reminder that they're not alone in that, it was hard for me to see anything beyond the tangled thorns of that situation. Difficult. But Paul wants to point to something else. And those families, amazingly, in the days and weeks to come, could share with me, yes, this is the most horrible thing that has happened to us. This is a terrible thing, but there's something else going on here. And they could talk about the presence of God and the peace that they experienced even in the midst of their grief. And those awful, wrenching times of grief would come, but there would also be present with those thorns this peace and this strength to get through it. Now that's what else Paul is pointing to. Because Paul says, of that thorn in the flesh, that stake driven in his flesh, he said, 3 times I prayed to the Lord that he would remove it from me. 3 times is an idiomatic expression. In Paul's culture, it means over and over and over and over and over again, and then again and again and again. Paul repeatedly prayed that God would remove this from him, whatever it was. As far as we know, Paul went to his grave with that thorn. We don't know. He never talks about the thorn being removed, but here's what he says the answer to his prayer was. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Now what Paul does is he names that other thing that was always present among the thorns, and he calls it grace. And in Paul, you can take the word grace and you can replace it with power in almost every instance where he uses it, and the meaning remains the same. For Paul, it was not just unmerited love and forgiveness of God. The word grace for Paul is the power of God when we are at our weakest. And so the answer he received was, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. And so Paul goes on to say, okay then, if I'm going to boast, let me boast of my weakness. Because when I am weak, he says, paradoxically, then I am strong. My power is made perfect in weakness, is the answer Paul receives. Susan Gregg Schroeder is a United Methodist pastor who wrote a book about her very difficult struggles with depression. It's called In the Shadow of God's Wings. And she talks about her experience as a pastor wrestling with depression and being afraid to let her congregation know what she was wrestling with. And she even, in one of her hospitalizations, she got a day pass to go to the church and preach and then return to the hospital and collapse. She was severely depressed. She was afraid the congregation wouldn't understand. Actually, when the congregation learned of it, not only did they understand, they embraced her They reached out to her. They supported her as any congregation should do. But in that book, she talks about how grace was present even in those most difficult circumstances. In that terrible, thorny mess of depression, trying to sort out the medication she needed and the counseling and whatever would work for her, what medication or combinations of medication. She had several hospitalizations, and in one of those, she was visited by her spiritual director, who brought communion to her. And there was really no furniture in the room. Of course there was no altar, no candlesticks, any of that for worship. But there wasn't even a table. And so she said that the spiritual director took the trash can and dumped everything out of it and turned it upside down. And they used the bottom of the trash can as a communion table. And for her, that communicated so much. That anything can be transformed into something good. And that even in the darkest, most difficult situation, God is present. And taking communion in that place in her life where she was reminded her that God's grace is sufficient, even in the most thorny situations. So I invite you to memorize that answer to Paul's prayer. Just a sentence. When you feel like you can't see beyond the thorns or can't see through the thorns, or everything looks like a thorn, remember Paul's answer. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. Amen.